Well, hello there. It's good to see you again. Welcome to week 9 of the Social Psychology of Work. We are nearing the home stretch now. I hope you've enjoyed the course thus far. This week, we'll be continuing our discussion of social identity theory. More specifically, we'll further explore the concepts of exaggeration and polarization, but this time, instead of using estimates of the length of lines, we'll be using social groups. I'll now pass it over to the professor so he can explain what we'll be learning about this week. Bye for now.
Thanks, Irving. Hi, everyone. I hope that you're doing well. Okay, so this week we'll extend our discussion of social identity theory. Now, I should preface this series of lectures by saying that we're moving into what you might call a dark side of human nature. I think most people find Goffman's dramaturgy to be insightful and also perhaps a bit funny. But social identity theory really is no laughing matter. One could even argue that the principles that we'll be talking about through the rest of this semester are in fact responsible for much of the atrocities in human history. So I want to warn everyone in advance that the next set of lectures are kind of a downer. But well, that's life. We can't turn a blind eye to the divisive nature of human beings. And in my view, it's only by understanding the source of those divisions that we can figure out how to reduce conflict and promote cooperation. Okay, so why don't we get started with the lecture? Let's talk a bit about social groups. There's an infinite number of ways to categorize a human being. Some categories are more meaningful, and some are effectively meaningless. Some are continuous, and some are discrete. For example, there are people who can be categorized as old or young. There are people who can be categorized as being in their 20s or in their 30s. And there are people who can be categorized as 27 years old or not 27 years old, right? So how else can we categorize people? Well, there are men and women. There are whites, blacks, East Asians, South Asians, etc. There are tall people and there are short people. There are people with red, brown, black, and blonde hair. There are people who have been to a beach and people who haven't. There are political conservatives and political progressives. There are Catholics and Protestants, Jews and Muslims and Hindus and atheists. There are biology majors and medieval history majors. There are people who like the taste of almond milk and people who don't. The list really goes on and on because, again, the number of categories that we can place on people is effectively infinite. But the key question from the point of view of social identity theory is how internally coherent these groups are and how distinguishable they are from other groups. People who like almond milk might not feel like they have much in common with other people who like almond milk because this is a pretty loosely constituted social group. But, for example, Indigenous or Aboriginal people belong to a very clearly defined social group. In this lecture series, we're going to look at how these important social groups are formed, sustained, and crucially, how they impact people in the workplace. Last week, we looked at how people exaggerate and polarize differences between inanimate objects, like jars and coins and lines. Now, if we exaggerate differences between objects, imagine how much we exaggerate differences between people. History is replete with intergroup conflict, often along national, religious, or ethnic lines. But looking at the big picture, the truth is that human beings aren't really that different from one another. For example, Genetic differences among all humans across the planet amount to a minuscule 0.1% of our DNA on average. Another way of stating this is that genetically, all people are effectively 99.9% identical when it comes to their DNA. But for whatever reason, we focus our attention on that 0.1%, and we construct artificial walls between us. We look for reasons to divide more than reasons to unite. And this is a common theme across all societies. There's something very human, although not particularly humane, about accentuating differences between social groups. We tend to minimize differences within groups that we belong to, and we maximize differences between groups. This exaggeration and polarization of human difference explains most genocide, ethnic cleansing, war, racism, sexism, bullying, and discrimination. When we are members of one social group, we tend to depersonalize and devalue members of the other. Throughout human history, religious differences in particular have been central to human conflict. Now, I'm going to show you a brief video to illustrate the extent of these differences, but I will say in advance that this video is disturbing. If you are highly sensitive to images of violence and conflict, then you can go ahead and skip forward by 3.5 minutes.
Just outside Bangui, the capital of the Central African Republic, a group of young Christians carry out a revenge attack on a Muslim village. It follows what they claim were earlier deadly assaults on them. Sectarian fighting in the former French colony has spiraled out of control.
Ils ont massacré les populations et tout le monde sont en brousse. C'est pas pour que les villageois sont en colère. C'est pourquoi qu'on a fait ça.
The country descended into intercommunal conflict after Muslim rebels seized power last March. But over the past month, the western region of the country has seen a dramatic increase in sectarian violence. Christian militias, known as anti-Balaka, have turned on the minority population following the resignation of the interim Muslim president. In a mass exodus, tens of thousands of Muslims are now being forced out of their country, some to neighbouring Chad and Cameroon.
C'est eux qui viennent dire qu'ils ne voulons pas les musulmans ici, ils vont venir tuer, les musulmans sont partis, les demander le pardon, on a donné le bœuf, on a donné de l'argent. Ils ne voulaient pas, ils disent qu'ils vont tuer seulement les gens de Baou.
Many can't leave and are seeking refuge in local churches. Whole neighbourhoods have been left deserted, areas where just weeks ago Muslims lived. Their houses looted, their mosques abandoned. Those who take to the road are frequently ambushed by the Christian militiamen from whom they are fleeing.
Les hommes des anti-Balaka demandent avec leurs chauffeurs de faire descendre les musulmans. Oui. C'est comme ça que les massacres des musulmans sont ici.
Hundreds have been killed since December. No one is spared.
Les anti-Balaka nous ont arrêtés. Ils ont pris ma mère, ma grand-sœur et ma soeur. Ils ont fouillé le village. Quand ils l'ont pris, ils l'ont déshabillé tout. Ils l'ont pris de l'argent. Et ils ont pris les petits menteurs. Ils l'ont tué. Ils l'ont partagé en deux.
Around 2,000 Muslims are currently waiting in a hangar at Bangui Airport, hoping to be flown out.
On est là comme ça. On est né ici, grandi ici, vieillir ici. Subitement, les gens commençaient à taper tout le monde. Si tu es musulman, on te tape, pas que rester ici. C'est pas votre pays, il faut partir. Et que cela, sauf là, on peut repousser tranquille. Nous, on n'a pas de pays.
Although there are almost 7,000 international peacekeepers in the country, from France and the African Union, they have no presence in many areas where violence is rife. Amnesty International is calling on the international community to urge full deployment to prevent further ethnic cleansing.
The exaggeration and polarization of group differences depends on our willingness to minimize within group differences. Of course, all groups are heterogeneous to some extent. There are many different types of Muslims or tall people or Asians. But we tend to minimize or even ignore within group variations and assume that members of the same group are more homogeneous than they actually are. This tendency to minimize within group differences leads to the development of stereotypes, which Tajfal defines, at least in relation to ethnic identity, as a consensus of opinion concerning the traits attributed to that group. Now, stereotypes can be accurate or inaccurate. Any empirically informed generalization is an accurate stereotype. For example, that Australians value freedom of speech. This is a stereotype, but it's also one that's generally true. But there are also stereotypes that are generally untrue. For example, Australians love to surf. Well, yes, some do, but not all of them, and probably not even a majority of them. Another stereotype might be that Australians ride kangaroos to school or work. Right? This one is obviously untrue, but the stereotype exists nonetheless. What stereotypes do is they present a fixed oversimplification about an individual based on his or her group membership. If we know nothing about an individual except that he or she is from Australia, then we might also assume that he or she supports freedom of speech. Almost all stereotypes are controversial because there will always be exceptions to the rule. Thus, there may be Australians who do not support freedom of speech. Within group sameness is often contrasted with between group differentness. Thus, in the same way that we exaggerate how similar we are vis-a-vis members of our own group, we also exaggerate how different we are vis-a-vis members of other groups. Generally speaking, two separate groups that are each internally homogeneous appear side by side to be more different from each other than two separate groups that are more heterogeneous. So we exaggerate differences across groups, and this is especially the case with reference to, for example, gender, nationality, and racial or ethnic divisions. The exaggeration of differences between men and women, between Americans and Mexicans, or between blacks and whites, is responsible for much of the employment discrimination that we see in the workplace. The key problem with the exaggeration of group differences is that they result in hierarchies and inequalities. Some social groups emerge as dominant and superior, and others as subordinate and inferior. Crucially, these differences, through the self-fulfilling prophecy, result in superiority and inferiority complexes, where members of dominant and subordinate groups begin to view themselves as superior or inferior. Such differences, which may be real or sometimes imagined, self-reinforce over time, leading to what social psychologists call path dependency. This means that dominant groups tend to remain dominant and subordinate groups tend to remain subordinate over time. All right, let's take a look at another video which shows the extent of the divide between members of different social groups. This time, disabled versus non-disabled people. As you watch, I'd like you to think about how this young man might fare in a job interview.
And because the way it's taught, they think I'm mentally disabled, which really frustrating sometimes.
Walk a day in Jordan Milroy's shoes.
That's a blatant discriminatory act there.
The 25-year-old has cerebral palsy, but from the way people stare and blatantly ignore him, he says he's made to feel like an alien.
People really negative and completely just blocked me out like I wasn't even there.
Tonight, Jordan and his friend Conan Visser from special needs charity I Can I Will want to demonstrate how hurtful people can be to those with disabilities, either deliberately
Excuse me.
or unconsciously.
They completely ignore me. Make me feel like I'm worth nothing.
People are intimidated and shy. They shy away from the situation because they don't know what to do.
This inspirational and intelligent larrikin has a following of over 20,000 people worldwide. Jordan Milroy is a star on social media because he's defying odds. He travels around the globe climbing towers to motivate others and raise awareness about cerebral palsy.
I am good. Just find the Christmas 111 cell and for 45 cents.
He's also just finished a bachelor degree in public relations.
I think as a disabled person, it's my responsibility to educate people. Before I started, I was in a wheelchair, depressed, and didn't want to do anything.
It's uncomfortable social situations like the ones you're about to see that makes Jordan and Conan desperate to change society's perceptions.
I was actually a little bit shocked initially, but it is kind of very usual for Jordan to experience on a daily basis.
Here, Jordan is about to ask a middle-aged couple where the closest bathroom is. They look, then incredibly, they ignore Jordan. But it's a different story when Conan approaches them.
Excuse us, guys. Do you know where the closest toilet is?
Probably Hungry Jack's.
Yeah, they're fine. They're actually more than helpful.
What about this businessman? He throws his hand out as soon as Jordan opens his mouth, indicating he won't help.
You look at Jordan and people are treating him like he has an intellectual disability.
But when Conan asks,
Excuse me, do you know where the closest toilet is?
Just up here, just near that horse there.
Yep.
Just there.
Okay, cool. Thank you. He was actually friendly.
It brings out the true colors in people. If that name bobs me up, what type of person is he really?
this shocking scenario blew our minds. Jordan approaches a man on a bench to ask for directions to a local store.
Excuse me.
3 times, and the man doesn't even look up at Jordan. But the same man immediately points Conan in the right direction. Jordan faces this a countless number of times throughout our social experiment.
For anyone to go through that, that's quite hurtful and damaging.
When Jordan drops his keys, even though a young woman witnesses it, she keeps walking. Thankfully, seconds later, a man runs over and helps. The kindness of this couple, though, brings tears to our eyes.
We'll take care.
This heartwarming gesture is what Jordan has been hoping for all day.
Why Jordan feels the best when people do that is because it's so rare, when it shouldn't be so rare.
People are disability, special needs. We're all the same. We all want to be included.
Don't you bring me down today.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about prejudice. First off, prejudice is not the same as discrimination. Prejudice is an attitude, whereas discrimination is a behavior. Prejudice can be explicit or implicit. Explicit prejudice is when the individual recognizes that he or she has negative feeling towards members of another social group. Implicit prejudice happens at a subconscious level, such that the individual may not be aware of his or her prejudicial attitudes. Of course, not all intergroup relations are hostile. Some are friendly. But intergroup relations can also be based on mutual hostility and/or antagonism. Economists will tell you that our behavior is grounded in rational choice. But social psychologists will tell you that our group membership also greatly impacts our behavior. Prejudice can be defined as an unsubstantiated prejudgment of an individual based on a faulty generalization to group membership. In other words, prejudice refers to the immediate or automatic negative judgment of another person by virtue of the social group to which they belong. Most typically, though not always, members of a minority group in a society are often subjected to prejudice. Non-whites, women, religious minorities, disabled people, political dissidents, people who are overweight or obese, gypsies, members of the LGBTI community, oppressed ethnicities, etc. Now, it should be noted that minority group here refers not so much to numbers, but rather to disadvantage. In some societies, the minority group by numbers is actually the more advantaged. For example, think about whites in South Africa or ethnic Chinese in Malaysia. In order to fully understand prejudice, you must first understand the interplay of categorization, assimilation, and the search for coherence. Let's start with a basic assumption of social relations. When you meet a stranger, you know absolutely nothing about that person's biography. You don't know their background. You don't know their values and beliefs. You don't know whether they are good or bad, whether they intend to help you or to harm you. Biographies are extremely complex and they cannot be communicated quickly. So when we meet a stranger, we lack information about their identity or their intentions towards us. This is where stereotypes come into play. Stereotypes introduce simplicity and order where there is extreme complexity. When we have little or no knowledge about another person, we use categorization to make inferences about the kind of person that he or she is. We look at people and immediately impose social categories. Once we do this, we often ignore data that disconfirm those categories and concentrate on data that confirm those categories. Categorization basically means that we take continuous data, like, for example, variations in skin color, and we turn those continuous data into discrete categories, like black people or white people. Thus, when we meet a stranger who's black, we make inferences based on his or her group membership. We polarize membership into different groups because it makes social interaction simpler for us. Crucially, most prejudiced people are emotionally invested in preserving status differentiation between groups. I'm now going to show you some photographs of people. And as you look at them, think about what kind of person each one is. Imagine that you're an employer. Would you want any of these people working for you? Why or why not? What about this guy? What are your first impressions? Would you hire him? I should probably disclose at this point that this guy happens to be my brother. What about him? And this guy? How are your perceptions of him different from the man in the previous photo? What about her? Do you think that she's better at English literature or mathematics? Would you be surprised if I told you that she was a Fields Medal winner? This is equivalent to the Nobel Prize for mathematics. What about this guy? Do you trust him? Why or why not? How about him? How are your perceptions of him different from the previous man you just looked at? What are the key differences between the two? And what about her? If she came to a job interview, would you hire her? Why or why not? And finally, what about this guy? Would you want him working for you? Seriously, I'd like to know because this curmudgeon is actually my cousin. The reason I'm showing you these photos is that I want you to think about why and how we categorize other people based on visual cues or traits. Okay, so we've just covered the process of categorization. The next process we need to understand in order to come to terms with human prejudice is assimilation. Assimilation refers to the processes of social learning, whereby social information is transmitted from the group to the individual. As individuals, we assimilate or we internalize the values, beliefs, and quintessential behaviors that are characteristic of the social groups to which we belong. This basically means that our sense of self is a product of our relationship and identification with established groups within society. This identification of the group begins in childhood and, according to psychologists, lays the foundations for prejudice later in adult life. Our sense of normal behavior really comes from others. Try to think about it in these terms. Baby boys are dressed in blue and baby girls in pink. Little boys play with trucks and guns. Little girls play with dolls. Boys don't cry, but girls can show emotion. Boys play baseball, whilst girls play softball. Boys wear trousers and girls wear dresses. Boys mow the lawn, while girls wash the dishes. Boys study math, science, and engineering, while girls study arts and humanities. All of these gender stereotypes influence the trajectories of men's and women's lives, including their careers. These external forces shape what we value and what matters to us. We learn who we are and how we should behave in relation to wider social groups and establish norms within those groups. This is effectively the process of socialization. Both categorization and assimilation explain the search for coherence, which is part of the human condition. The world is extremely complex. Trying to understand things and individuals is a difficult business. When we meet people for the first time, we know nothing about them, and that doesn't sit well with us. So we naturally try to seek out order, coherence, and meaning in social life. And it's stereotypes that allow us to do this. They help to improve our predictability in social relations. Through stereotypes, we can better understand others without knowing their biography. Their group membership says something about themselves as individuals. Now, what it says is not always right, of course, but it still says something. We impute inherent differences between groups, but in fact, these differences are not natural, they're social and therefore malleable. In identifying with our own social group, we attempt to improve our own status by putting other groups at a disadvantage. This is at the very heart of prejudice. We are prejudiced against others out of fear of losing group status. Okay, we're going to talk more about stereotypes and prejudice in the second half of this lecture series, but for now I'm going to hand it over to Irving so that he can tell you about this week's online forum activity. I'll see you all in a bit. Bye for now.